Hi, I'm Talia Baroncelli, and you're watching theAnalysis-news. Today I'll be joined by political analyst Yasser Louati. We'll be discussing President Emmanuel Macron's authoritarian decisions after the results of the French legislative elections. We'll also be discussing his decision to ban Muslim female athletes from wearing the veil at the upcoming Olympics. If you'd like to support the work we do, please go to our website, theAnalysis.news. You can hit the donate button at the top right corner of the screen and get onto our mailing list. That way you're always up to date every time we publish new interviews. Please like and subscribe to the show on YouTube or wherever else you watch this show, be it on Apple or other podcast streaming services such as Spotify. See you in a bit with Yasser. Joining me now is Yasser Louati. He's a political analyst as well as the head of the Committee for Justice and Liberties. He's also been featured in a documentary film on Islamophobia called The Flag, which is directed by Joseph Paris and is set to come out on October 30th. Thanks so much for joining me today, Yasser.
Thank you for having me.
So we've been speaking about this in the past as well, speaking about Macron and French democracy, the dynamism of French democracy, but also the controversies of laïcité and secularism and Islamophobia in France. So I first wanted to start off with the results of the French parliamentary elections. And of course, as everyone knows, as people have been following, the New Popular Front was able to gain 182 seats. The National Rally gained, I think it was 143 seats, so that's Marine Le Pen's party, and then Macron's Ensemble or Together coalition got 168 seats. So Macron said that no one coalition or that no one has actually won the parliamentary elections, that no one coalition or one party has won. But if you look at the numbers, the New Popular Front, which is comprised of 4 different political parties, including Jean-Luc Mélenchon's France Unbowed, they won the most amount of seats. So is Macron engineering a coup here?
Well, the coup is actually the term I thought of. First, we have to remind our audience abroad that Emmanuel Macron made this gamble that he will call for snap elections and give a minimum amount of time for the campaign in order to outmaneuver both the right and the left, and then position his party as the sole one capable of winning the election, because they would have been prepared, because they had been in power for the past 2 years, actually 7 years if we count the previous legislature. However, Emmanuel Macron lost on all fronts. The right, of course, got fell, in a defeat. It got defeated, but the far right came ahead. But the left even won even more seats. However, Emmanuel Macron lost in his own game because he gambled or bet that the left wouldn't be able to unite in such a short amount of time. We're talking about 4 days. And the French left has been in a civil war for years, if not decades. They did manage to get their act together to position themselves as a single coalition and did come ahead in the election. However, they fell short, actually very, very short, by a large margin from having the absolute majority. But if Emmanuel Macron says that no one won the election because no party indeed got the absolute majority in the National Assembly, then that would apply to his own party, which failed to secure an absolute majority back in 2022. So how is it that he can accept for his party to have no absolute majority to the point of governing with the 49-3 article of the Constitution, the infamous 49.3, which allows the government to pass legislation without votes? And what we are seeing right now is Emmanuel Macron holding on to his power, accepting that his own ministers remain in power despite having, forward or given their resignation. So basically, we have a president governing on his own without a government and without acknowledging the defeat of his party and also the victory of the New Popular Front.
Yeah, just to remind our audience, an absolute majority would require winning 289 seats out of 577 seats. And as you mentioned, in the past, Macron didn't even have that absolute majority, and yet he was able to form a government, because that's how the French tradition in the Fifth Republic ever since 1958 works. And so Macron is now saying that his Prime Minister, Gabriel Attal, should stay on as a caretaker until after the elections, but he's refused to pick a Prime Minister from the New Left Alliance, the New Popular Front, which is the Left Alliance. And I wanted to speak to you about Jean-Luc Mélenchon's statement. So Jean-Luc Mélenchon is the leader of France Unbowed, and he released a statement. This is the English translation, obviously. So Mélenchon, in response to Macron not recognizing that the Left Alliance actually won the most amount of seats, said that this isn't an event just like any other. No one committed to our republic can minimize its political significance or the extremely serious moment we're in. In a letter to the French people, the President of the Republic claims that nobody won the election. This is not true. Everyone knows that. The Nouveau Front Populaire came out on top in the election, and it is up to it to form the next government. In all the world's democracies, this is how elections decide who the government will be, whether or not it has an absolute majority of MPs. What do you make of what Mélenchon is saying there?
Well, actually, what Jean-Luc Mélenchon said is absolutely true. We can disagree with him on many things, but on this one, he's absolutely spot on. But beyond what Jean-Luc Mélenchon wrote and actually said times and times again, is that we are seeing a man like Emmanuel Macron who thinks democracy is only about going to the booth every 5 years. What he is actually displaying by refusing to acknowledge not only his defeat, but also the victory of the New Popular Front, and the fact that he must, offer them the opportunity to designate a prime minister. We have here an explicit display of a lack of cultural, of democratic culture coming from the president. And this actually falls in line with the fact that Emmanuel Macron had never won an election before becoming a president back in 2017, which means we have a man who thinks power should be held by a strong man. And this is where French democracy, especially with the constitution of what you just reminded our audience, the constitution of 1958, which set the Fifth Republic will live under, is coming to its limits, because Emmanuel Macron is using this gray area in which there is no clear obligation for the president to designate the prime minister from the winning party, using the fact that they did not win an absolute majority. At the same time, we have to look into what's happening in the halls of the National Assembly. The president of the National Assembly, Yael Braun-Pivet, who has tremendous powers in organizing the debates in the National Assembly, has been re-elected despite her coming from the party that came third. So which means we have the losing party re-electing its former president. And this is a problem. First, if she had some common decency, she wouldn't run for re-election. She would acknowledge, my party lost, I should step aside and let someone else take over. That did not happen. The second point, the New Popular Front came up with a candidate, Mr. Chassaigne from the French Communist Party. He actually secured a win in the first and second round, but she won in the third round. And this is again a loophole in the French constitution, because the ministers of the Macron government under Gabriel Attal had handed their resignation. But because they handed their resignation, they became MPs again. However, we have two interpretations of the constitution. Should they come back as MPs and not vote, or come back as MPs and then be allowed to vote? And where we can speak of a coup is not only Braun-Pivet was re-elected, but she was re-elected with the votes of those former ministers. So the ministers of the political party that lost the election voted for her and made her again the president of the National Assembly. While at the same time, the president refuses to let the New Popular Front put forward a candidate. Now we have Mrs. Castell being, chosen by them. And despite the threat of the far right, which has still secured nearly 11 million votes, Emmanuel Macron right now is showing tremendous signs of immaturity and also a lack of democratic awareness.
Yeah, he's a very Jupiterian leader. It seems like he's displaying immense autocratic characteristics right now. And something, I mean, there's the contrast when you perceive it from outside of France. You see him trying to hold on to power, but then you also see the dynamism of the French parliamentary system, where in the second round of elections, you had, in these three-way runoffs, you had parties standing down so that this far-right majority or absolute majority was able to be prevented. And so different parties came together, and some of them dropped out of the race in order to prevent the far-right, the National Rally, from gaining even more seats. So when you see that compared to a system, for example, in the United States, where despite weeks and weeks of pressure, it took a really long time for Joe Biden to step out of the, or to drop out of his re-election campaign. So it's quite incredible to see this contrast and how people and parties are able to mobilize, but you still have a figure like Macron. So I wanted to ask you, though, who were the other potential candidates that the left could have put forward as prime minister? It seems like Melenchon would have been too much of a divisive figure. Who was Huguette Bello, for example, the president of the regional council in Réunion, which is a overseas territory of France in the Indian Ocean? Would she have been a potentially better candidate?
Huguette Bello, she ticked all the boxes in terms of experience, tenure, in terms of political backbone, political courage. We have, actually she was dismissed partly because she had dared to vote against the 2004 law banning the headscarf in public schools at a time where you had a massive agreement, across all parties that, the headscarf should be banned. She said, the protection of the secular law means protecting the state from religious interference, not imposing religious neutrality on users of state services. It takes tremendous courage to go against the dominant narrative and to say, I, as a non-white woman, will vote against it. And her whole experience in the island of the Reunion in the Indian Ocean showed that she had a track record of left-wing policies, but what she was also being blamed for, especially from the Socialist Party, which is the equivalent of the elitist Democratic Party in the US, they are neoliberal compatible, they don't believe in reforming capitalism. They should just show, follow the footsteps and minimize its, effects on people. And that did not work. And the reason why the Socialist Party almost went extinct a few years ago is because François Hollande, who was elected on a leftist platform, ended up passing the most right-wing social economic policies of the past 2 decades. This same party has dismissed Huguette Bello because they were afraid she would be too much of a leftist and she would be too critical of Emmanuel Macron. And of course, the Socialist Party deemed her to be too close to Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who is perceived as a divisive figure. It's a loss for France. It would have made history to see a non-white woman from the Indian Ocean becoming the first female, or actually the first non-white prime minister in France, but also not only acting as a symbol. I mean, this is not Kamala Harris in the US with her intellectual and political vacuity. We are talking of a woman with the shoulders to carry the country forward. Unfortunately, the leftist elites of France prefer to cast her aside. We will see now what will take place with Mrs. Castell, who so far shows signs that she might be able to carry this left-wing platform forward.
Well, this takes us to the question of what is the far left or the extreme left. I mean, I've spoken about this in the past with other guests, but what does that really mean? Because Jordan Bardella, who is leading the campaign of the National Rally, after the Left Alliance did so well and gained the most amount of seats, he called them the Alliance of Dishonor, probably referring to the accusations and the weaponization of anti-Semitism against Jean-Luc Mélenchon and his party, France Unbowed. So, of course, Jordan Bardella, by mentioning that, is obviously not being genuine himself, because there's obviously racism and actual anti-Semitism within the National Rally itself. So he's lobbying that accusation against the left to discredit them. But that aside, he also called Jean-Luc Mélenchon's party the extreme left. So who is really the extreme one here? Obviously, I would argue it's the National Rally and Marine Le Pen's party, but even Macron. I mean, Macron, isn't he, in what he's doing and almost orchestrating a coup, and with his pension reforms and neoliberal policies, isn't he the extreme one?
Well, we have a history on that in France. And back in the 1930s, we had the original Popular Front, and the French financial and political elite had a famous chorus. Hitler mieux que le Front Populaire. It is better to have a Hitler in power than the Popular Front. So they prefer to have the far right in power, and that's why the French bourgeoisie had Philippe Pétain rule France instead of Léon Blum, for instance. In our case today, in 21st century France, we are seeing the same thing. Emmanuel Macron first made sure that his sole opposition was the far right. He made sure that in 2017 and in 2022, he would only debate against the far right. The idea being to hijack the election and tell French people it is either me, despite my high unpopular, stature, or chaos and the far right. As a matter of fact, that's exactly what he might have wanted with the call for snap elections less than a month ago. So we see that first, the extremist in power is Emmanuel Macron. A true Democrat would never do what he's doing right now. Second, the far-right party is the party that was set up by former Waffen SS, former supporters of Vichy, and the OAS, the organization of the secret army that tried to overthrow France back in the 1950s. So we have a party set up by truly anti-Semites with a proven track record in torturing people and deporting Jews, telling the left that they are the anti-Semites. This is truly an Orwellian moment where we see that the extremists are calling the left the extremists. If you have to put things to perspective, the current Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who is dubbed a left-wing extremist, is less on the left than the left-wing government of François Mitterrand in the 1980s. He's not calling for abolishing capitalism. He's only calling for fiscal justice and environmental justice. That's what he's calling for, and that is deemed extremism in France. And this has actually been theorized by the Macron sphere with the Republican arc, that they will decide who is a legitimate opponent, provided that they are, incapable of reaching power. So to them, the far right are more of part of the Republican arc than the France Insoumise, because the political elite in France, the financial system in France, and the bourgeoisie in France do not want to see a left-wing government putting into question the neoliberal policies of the past 40 years, let alone impose fair and just taxation on their profits, but also on the stock market.
Yeah, just to give some more context, you've also had some high-profile Jews in France, such as Holocaust survivor and famous Nazi hunter Serge Klarsfeld, whose father was deported to Auschwitz, never to return. He said that he would actually vote for the National Rally despite its historical links to Vichy and to fascism and the war in Algeria. So in a way, this also represents the way the National Rally has tried to purify its image, to present itself as being neither left nor right, as being more of a nativist party, but the links to the party it came out of, the National Front, that is still obviously there.
There has been no revamping. I'm sorry for interrupting you, but has been no revamping. They only cleaned the showcase. We had candidates in France taking pictures with an SS hat. We had staunch anti-Semites declaring that the Jews are rotting the French political system and that their corruption is bringing France to the abyss. The National Front made a strategic turn under Marine Le Pen by steering clear from anti-Semitism, showing absolute and unconditional support to Israel, but focusing their racism on Muslims, and because Islamophobia is in fact an acceptable and even an encouraged form of racism. That Serge Klarsfeld, the famous Nazi hunter can today come forward and say he would vote for Marine Le Pen shows not only his own moral collapse, but also that anti-Semites get a pass in France, but also in Austria and in the US, the likes of Steve Bannon or the likes of Geert Wilders, as long as they support Israel. Conflating being Jewish and being an Israeli Zionist involved in the genocide of the indigenous population. This is where the collapse of these elites who claim to speak on the behalf of Jews are fueling anti-Semitism by whitewashing historic anti-Semitic organizations in the name of protecting Israel's apartheid and genocide in Palestine.
Yeah, and I mean, what are the charges against Melenchon? That he supports basic human rights, the rights for Palestinians to self-determination and to have their own state. I mean, there's no substance to the charges there.
Because the fact that you can humanize Palestinians sufficiently to give them the right to exist as a people and to fight back against oppression, I mean, to me, in the moment where everyone is chanting support to Ukraine, while at the same time chanting support for Israel and dismissing Palestinians' right to self-defense, is absolutely, it's an abomination in our time and age. Time and age. Why? Because people are watching a genocide unfold before our eyes, and the West is constantly looking for an excuse not to look at it. I'm sorry, Jean-Luc Mélenchon might be criticizable for many things, and I've been a staunch critic of Jean-Luc Mélenchon for years, if not decades. But on this one, he's been unfairly being targeted the same way Jeremy Corbyn has been targeted for his pro-Palestinian support. And again, this shows these unbearable double standards that are actually accelerating this historic moment, because the West can no longer claim to have the moral high grounds when it comes to international affairs. Ukraine has shown Western hypocrisy when it comes to fighting against oppression and pushing back against occupation. I'm going to speak as a French citizen here. I, Yasser Louati, say Palestinians have the right to self-defend against occupation and to fight by all available means against the ongoing genocide targeting them. This is a human stance, and if people think that this should be conditional, well, I'm sorry. You are too racist to see Palestinians as your equal human beings.
So I agree with you, but I would also, again, and I'm speaking as Talia, who's a Canadian-Italian citizen here, if you want to bring it more to a personal level, that I personally don't think violence against civilians is ever justified, but that it is, of course, justified against military.
No one does, of course.
Yeah,
no one does. No, the issue is because even if we speak about it, no one said it is okay to target civilians. We are saying when you are being targeted and expelled from your homeland, when you don't even have access to water, food, and you live under the biggest prison, open sky prison, you cannot be told, well, you should wait for the UN or the European Union to make up its mind about your right to fight back or not. We're only saying if you are conditioning the existence of Palestinians to your moral compass, Palestinians are going to be wiped out. And I'm sorry, they have the right. I'm not saying that we're going to condone anything. I'm just saying Palestinians have the right to defend themselves. And conditions should not be put upon them. Conditions should be put upon those occupying them, the occupying military force, with far greater means than the occupied Palestinians.
And I should just point out, this is something that's often left out of the discourse when speaking about violence, is that there was a huge march, I think it was in 2019, which Hamas actually supported, a non-violent march in which the Israeli soldiers then, they were shooting at protesters, shooting at their kneecaps, trying to see how many peaceful protesters they could shoot. And so this is an instance in which non-violence was used as a form of protest. And that often gets ignored in the discourse.
I mean,
again, I'm not saying that they should have then switched over to violence.
Let's be factual and look at the track record. Boycott is anti-Semitic. Marching is anti-Semitic. Self-defense is anti-Semitic. But supporting anti-Semitic organizations by Israel and the Israeli embassies across the West is not anti-Semitic. At some point, we have to look at the facts, and the facts are stubborn. What are Palestinians left with just to exist? I mean, for God's sake, we are watching this in horror, and our feeling of powerlessness is compounded by the hypocrisy of our governments. I mean, I'm in Paris right now. We are welcoming the Olympics. I mean, welcoming is a big word. I'm not very a fan of them with the way they're being organized, but that's a side question. And we can ban Russian delegations, but we can welcome Israeli athletes, with some of them having taken part in the killing of innocent civilians in Palestine, and on top of it, welcoming the genociders in chief, either Netanyahu or the Israeli president, who compared the Palestinians to human beasts and spoke of the Amaleks in order to justify their wiping out. Honestly, this is an unbearable moment. But of course, when we see that Emmanuel Macron is supporting that with either his silence or opening his arms to the Israeli delegations, we see that at the same time, it is the people in the streets who are standing for Palestine, which means that we have again a split between the people and the elite.
Yeah, and just to add to those facts that you mentioned, there was, of course, a recent decision taken by the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, in which 68 members voted against the creation of a Palestinian state. I think there was maybe 8 or 9 people who opposed that, which just shows the degree of fascism in Israel right now when it comes to their government. And then the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, also ruled in an advisory opinion, which unfortunately isn't binding, but still consists of international law, that the occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza is actually an annexation. It is unlawful and illegal. If it would just be a temporary occupation, it could somehow, under international law, be justified, but it's not. It's been going on for far too long. They've definitively said that the conditions in which they're imposing on the Palestinians there is unlawful. It amounts to an annexation. And that's the same sort of annexation that, the international community says Russia committed against Ukraine by annexing Crimea. So if we want to compare those two, I mean, totally different contexts, of course, but these laws are actually, they mean something. There's substance to them. So that ICJ ruling was incredibly important. And Israel also just voted to characterize UNRWA, the relief and works agency for Palestinians, as being a terrorist organization. So, I'm 100% with you on what you're saying, is that it's clear what's going on here. This is plausibly a genocide. It's in legal terms, plausibly a genocide. I would say in moral terms, it is a genocide, and it's a massacre. It's horrible. But I think if we get back to the French context and the Olympics, just leading into the Olympics, you see how the discourse of secularism is used to paper over some of the divisions within French society. So I wanted to ask you about laïcité, which is the secularism law instituted in 1905, because Macron is using and weaponizing this law to say that female athletes should not wear or are not allowed to wear a veil in order to compete in the Olympics. This is something that Amnesty has said is, it's not something which should be accepted. It's not in line with the spirit of the Olympics. And just to give some context here, what is laïcité? Article 1 says the Republic ensures freedom of conscience. It guarantees freedom of worship, limited only by the following rules in the interest of public order. Those rules would be in Article 2, which talks about the separation of religion and state. The Article 2 states that the Republic neither acknowledges nor pays for nor subsidizes any form of worship. That all seems reasonable to me, but can you speak about how this secularism has actually been distorted to oppress the freedom of religion of Muslims?
Well, the racism of the French elites and its deep-rooting in French society was no longer acceptable by the 1970s and 1980s after the organizing of Arab and Black workers coming from predominantly Muslim countries, which were themselves former colonies. So they had to find a legal argument to justify that. And the French Jim Crow, if I may, of course, I'm just using that, for easiness of language, was that laicity was a forgotten law. No one spoke of laicity for decades since 1905, which is the religious neutrality of the state, and there is complete separation between church and state. That's it. By the 1980s, as these Muslims became visible and were no longer, as statistics, they became social beings organizing and marching against racism, against unfair payment, against police brutality, etc. This came as a shock to French elites. I mean, they feel so French, they can demand equality. So let's rig the game again in our favor and use what we have at hand. And laicity was redefined from the neutrality of the state to the neutrality of users of state services. And in the case of France right now, as I speak of the Olympics, the banning of the headscarf shows how France has been and continues to be the laboratory of Islamophobia, which inspires other countries abroad, because France being, of course, the shining beacon of human rights, other, more autocratic regimes can say, if France can do it, so can we. Same applies with China, India, etc. In the case of France, they banned the headscarf for Muslim female athletes, whereas this contravenes the rulings of the FIFA for football or soccer in North America, contravenes the Olympic Committee, etc. So much so that as we speak right now, foreign female athletes can wear the headscarf, but not French female athletes. This is open religious segregation taking place, bluntly in the face of the Olympics Committee without them saying anything. The second point is that France, of course, gets a pass. How is it that international federations are asked to abide by human rights, civil liberties, equality, and fairness between men and women, etc.? Say no to racism before each football game across pitches in Europe, while at the same time, French football players get dismissed for either fasting the month of Ramadan, for wearing the headscarf, let alone support Palestinians. We see here that we do have a deep-rooted racism that transpires even in sports organizations, the same organizations that are supposed to be a safe haven for everyone. If society is racist, at least in sports, I can exist. And this is where the secular law has been mobilized time and time again to exclude Muslims from mainstream French society if they choose to exist as Muslims, but also to put millions of Muslim women in a position of a social death sentence. A few statistics. If you are a Muslim woman wearing a headscarf, you stand a 1% chance of having a job. 1%. That's from the European Network Against Racism, the Forgotten Women Study. If you are a Muslim person applying for a job in France, according to the Paris School of Business, under Marie-Anne Valfort, it shows that you have to apply 5 times more to secure one job interview, discounting the result of you being dismissed because your name is Muslim, etc. So unfortunately, an excellent law like laïcité of 1905, which was meant to protect minority religions, Jews, Protestants, and of course Muslims, has been weaponized to become a tool of mass discrimination in France.
Well, Yasser Louati, it's been great speaking to you, especially leading up to the Olympics and in light of what's going on in France right now with the elections.
Thank you for having me.
Hopefully we can have you on again soon. And thank you for watching theAnalysis.news. If you'd like to support us, you can go to our website, theAnalysis.news, and give a donation if you're in a position to do so. See you next time.